because, as I said earlier, this was one of the main things that got brought up when we were doing our debate, right? It was this question of index fossils, it was this question of dating, it was this question of surely the geological column is accurate and surely we can correlate the geological column with other places around the world and therefore end up getting evidence over millions of years. But I like to remind people what my old professor said when I was visiting a geological location in Norfolk, and you had some rocks that were supposed to be around 100 million years old. And then sitting on top of these rocks, there were some other rocks that were only supposed to be about 500,000 years old. In other words, they were missing almost 100 million years rather of Earth's history. And this was a very interesting location because there was actually one or two places where the so-called older rocks were actually on top of the so-called younger rocks. So there's definitely been some shifting and changing and some interesting stuff going on there. But you see, I did ask my professor, well, how do we know what happened during those 100 million years or 99.5 million years, right? And his response was, well, the geological column is a bit like a book that is not written in your language, that has had all of the numbers removed, page numbers removed, has been ripped up, and all the pages have been spread across the world, and you've got to try and fit it together again. He said you've actually got to travel to other places and try and interpret the rocks to fit them into this missing 100 million years. And so I was grateful that he was an honest geologist, even though still an evolutionary one. But it makes a rather interesting point. What do you actually find when you go out there and dig up the rocks? And does it actually match up together and make any sense? Well, here's my slides, and we're starting off with a little report. We've started a new little project off the back of some great advice. So thank you very much to the people who've been helping us with some of the social media ideas. We've actually started to pull some different quotes together from the Ask site and the fact file and things that different members of creation research, all of us, have said, and put them onto our Facebook with a little bit of a link into some of those articles and teaching sessions. This is one that went up just a day ago, and it's already getting lots and lots of interest and lots of comments and lots of critics as well. So we'll be putting more out a little bit later. Evolution is nothing more than ancient paganism redressed as science. Yes, that's the program that I did with David Reeves, and I've spoken about a number of times. We'll have to do it on creation research at some point. But you see, this was a quote that we put up first of all from the Mr. John Mackay. Slow fossils are no fossils. It simply doesn't work. And tomorrow, a third quote will be going out from John, and it is actually relevant to what we're talking about now. Education becomes the worst form of brainwashing when there are questions that you're forbidden to ask. The question we're asking tonight is one of those questions. We saw some of the so-called evidence, or rather some of the so-called story, which is supposedly backed up by evidence, that Craig's son had to deal with. But you see, if you go and start challenging this and start questioning it, then you very quickly get shut down. Well, we like to challenge and question things at creation research, and we also like to do what the Bible says and actually go out there and prove all things, actually test things, actually see what the real world is showing. So what's this kind of testing look like? Well, this is what I've been doing over the last couple of days. We actually have been gluing an Apatosaurus rib bone back together. I mean, when it came out of the dig site, it was reconstructed. It was in two pieces when we picked it up. We put it ourselves into 4 pieces so that we could get it back into the UK easily. And then as we started gluing things along, more bits started coming off. So we've spent a good couple of days fixing it all back together, but it's a pretty sizable rib bone. You can see young Alice there who's been helping us. It's come together quite nicely. It's about 8 foot in length. It's obviously curved, so from top to bottom in the curved shape, if you like, from one tip to the bottom, it's about 6 foot high. So it's a pretty decent sized rib bone. And well, we've taken some samples of it to do some interesting tests, and we'll be able to report on that one day. So thank you to all the volunteers and the helpers that came and helped us put it all back together again and fix it up and sort it out. But you see, we try and encourage people to get out there and see what the real fossils actually say. such as this fossil, which, well, there's a funny story that came from this. You see, I didn't collect this fossil. This actually came from John's collection. But you see, John Mackay had left it in Germany. You see, this is where this fossil came from. It's from the Solnhofen in Germany. There's an interesting connection between this fossil and this location and the geological column. But you see, John had left this in a box of bits with one of our trustees, and this trustee was moving back to England from Germany, so he bought the box of bits and he gave it to me and said, "This is all John's old stuff. I'm leaving it with you now, right?" So I opened up the lid and started digging through, had to go through John's underwear, but finally down at the bottom we found this fossil that was in there. It's a pretty decent fossil. It's from the Solnhofen in Germany, and you see the German rocks are the original Jurassic rocks, because it was Alexander von Humboldt who actually traveled the world. He was the king's geographer, and he actually named these rocks the Jurassic, named after the rocks in the Jura Mountains in Germany. But I'm talking about the history now, and that's John's section in a little bit. But you see, what can you see here on this rock? On the right-hand side, you've got one of those curly-whirly ammonites. On the left-hand side, looking like a sort of a spindly hand coming out there, you've actually got a fossil plant. Now, it's so well preserved, we actually know what kind of plant it is. It belongs to the Araucarias, the southern conifer pine trees. You see, they're still alive today. They live in the southern hemisphere, hence southern conifers. You've got the slightly tougher South American ones that we call monkey puzzle trees here in the UK. But down in Australia and New Zealand, you've got tons of these things, from the Norfolk pines to the Bunyan pines. They're all the same Araucaria type tree. Okay, so number one, it's a living fossil. And you see, even though you want to argue that these rocks are 159 million years, all you've proven is that in 159 million years, one fossil has not evolved and the other fossil has died out. And neither of those are any good for evolution, right? As far as we're aware, the ammonites have gone extinct, but from the moment they appear in the fossil record to the moment they go extinct, they stay as ammonites. They don't evolve from anything, they don't evolve into anything, so there's no evidence of evolution. And you see, no matter how far back you go, pine trees, southern conifers have always been southern conifers. So you do have to ask the question, well, if there's no evidence for evolution in the rocks, then why are we arguing that they are millions of years old? It's interesting when you think about it. But you see, really getting down into the rocks and seeing what's there is so important, because there's one thing you might not have picked up yet. You see, the fossil rather on the right-hand side is a fossil of a deep-sea creature. On the left-hand side, it's the fossil of a land plant. Now, you see, we like to point out that whenever you've got a deep-sea creature and a land plant that are buried together, you've got evidence of a flood. I mean, think about it. What is a flood? A flood is water where water shouldn't be. If you've got a flood in your kitchen, the water is on the floor. The water doesn't belong on the floor, it belongs in the sink. And so you've got a flood in your kitchen, right? Because the water's on the floor. Now, you see, where does water belong? In the sea, in the rivers, in the oceans. And you've got animals that are living in it, like the ammonite. But if you've got an ammonite and a land plant buried together, then it tells you that water has come up onto the land, it's swept over the land, it's caught up the plants, and it's buried them next to the sea creatures. And you see, you actually have to bury them in something. It can't just be water. You actually have to have fast-flowing water, fast enough to carry sediment, a great big slurry of sediment to actually be able to bury it all together. Okay, well, let's take you to England. Let's take you to the south coast of England. Right down at the bottom of the south coast, there's a place called the Jurassic Coast. You see, it's that stretch of coast that's named after those rocks in the Jura Mountains, the Jurassic rocks. Okay, what do you find there? Well, we had a convention there a couple of years ago. We've got our convention coming up this year. It's to Whitby, which is also to Jurassic Rocks, up in the northeast of the United Kingdom. But we're down here in the south. We had a great time with the seminars and the lectures and the digging up of the fossils. Simon will be speaking at our conference again this year, so do get in touch and find out more and even come along. But you see, every day we would go down on the coast of the Jurassic Coast onto the beach, and we would dig up fossils. And here is Diane Eager. And Diane Eager is looking very pleased with herself because she's found a fossil. You can see the long brown thing there. This is a piece of fossil wood. In fact, it's so well preserved, we know what type of tree it's from. It's from those same southern conifer trees, the same fossils that are in Germany and the same rock type that is found in Germany. It's interesting. And look what she's found next to it, a curly-whirly ammonite. So you see the point that we looked at in those German rocks stands here as well. You see you have land plants and you have deep sea creatures buried together, so that equals a flood for sure. No doubt about it. Now, you see, this is a really key point, and this is why we encourage people to come on our field trips. This is why we encourage people to go out in the real world and dig up the fossils, because you see, all throughout university, I was taught you go and you look at the rocks and you reconstruct an ecosystem based on the fossils that are in the rocks. So if it's a tropical terrestrial fossils, then it's a tropical terrestrial type environment that is represented in the rocks. If it's all shallow marine, it's shallow marine environment. If it's all deep sea, it's all deep sea, and so on and so forth. The reality is, however, it's just a mess. And when you actually get out there in the real world and you really dig up real fossils, this is the conclusion you come to. There's no doubt about it, a flood has formed these rocks here. And so you see, we're so useful when we're doing debates to actually challenge people, because I can guarantee you one thing: out of almost every single person on that open mic debate that challenged me and John about the geological column, we came back with this point: when you go out there and you dig up the fossils, you find that it is a mess. It is a mixed environment. And out of all the people, only one had ever been on a fossil hunting trip. He dug up fossils once by his own admission, and he just hadn't happened to find any. Well, John and I have been all over the world. We've dug these fossils up. There's no doubt about it. It's a great big mess, and you find enormous amounts of these fossils all the way throughout the so-called geological column. In fact, you find things like this. No, not Susie we're talking about. We're talking about what Susie's found. She's found a nautilus, and a nautilus is a living fossil. They're still alive today. And so even though these rocks are supposed to be almost 200 million years old, 199 million years old, there's no evidence for evolution in the rocks either. So yes, we do encourage you, come on a fossil hunting field trip with us. See the real evidence for yourself, and you too can come to the same conclusion about the rocks in the geological column as John and I have, as well as Professor Derek Ager. Look at what he had to say. Nowhere in the world is the record, that's the geological record, or even part of it, anywhere near complete. Even in the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River and the adjacent sections along the Little Colorado River, surely the finest record of geological history anywhere on Earth, there are huge breaks. I mentioned that earlier, right, with the almost missing 100 million years, and John mentioned that earlier with the great, and Craig mentioned it with the great unconformity, right? Interesting point. But you see, Professor Derek Ager was also one of these people who actually went out there and actually looked at the real evidence. But I want to make a couple of important points, right? A personal testimony from myself when I was in university. And we went to a location to go and dig up fossils. And, well, I thought we were going to dig up fossils anyway. It turned out it was a field trip, right? But it turned out that the field trip was just a lecture on the beach. It was boring. That's why I try and model my field trips the way that John does his, because you see, we like to actually get people to dig up fossils and actually ask questions about the rocks. But you see, I was here, right, on this field trip at a place called Hunstanton. Now, I'd been digging up fossils from Hunstanton for as long as I could walk almost, right? So I knew the place like the back of my hand. And the professor there was walking along and he said, students, you see all these rocks here? These are all entirely made up of marine fossils. Therefore, we can conclude that it was a shallow marine environment that formed these rocks. And I put my hand up and I said, "Excuse me, Prof, what about the fossil trees?" He said, "There aren't any fossil trees here." I said, "Yes, there are." I said, "Let me show you." So I took him and I showed him the fossil trees that are found at Hunstanton in the Carstone. And he'd never seen them before. And I said, "Well, I'd love to claim that I found them, but I said, when I did find them, and I was amazed, I went back and checked the records, and you see Adam Sedgwick, back in the 1800s, contemporary of Darwin and the like, right, but a creationist, he had actually, if you go to Sedgwick's museum, you can see them up on the shelf, a great big fossil tree from Hunstanton." And he said, "Well, I've never come across this before." I said, "So how does this actually work then with your idea that this is completely a marine environment deposit?" And he said, "I don't know, I'm going to have to go away and think about it. And I'll let you know." Well, I never did hear from him right after that, because I went on to another year of university and moved on to a different tutor and a different professor. But I also remained back in the Facebook group for that module. And you see, I noticed a year later that they were also going on a field trip, also to Hunstanton. This is the next year's students, right? Also to Hunstanton, also led by the same professor. And the day after, I went on the computer and I said, "Did the professor mention the fossil trees?" They said, "No, he said that it was purely a marine environment." You see, sometimes people are so caught up and trapped in the picture of the world that they want to believe that they are willing to go as far as to, well, at best, forget or ignore the evidence, at worst, deliberately hide the evidence. Because you see, even though I knew exactly where those fossil trees were in the museum, I've never been able to find them whenever I've gone back. And I only ever disappeared after I happened to mention them. So I can't prove anything, but you certainly do get reports of people deliberately being willing to hide evidence, because as the Bible says, people are willfully ignorant, and it says that the God of this world has blinded them to the truth. So yes, our challenge to you is to get out there and actually see what the real evidence says, because the real evidence of the geological column points a very, very different picture of the world. In fact, it's not a geological column, it is purely illogical, and we need a new way of actually understanding the rocks.